Hey, my name is Caleb Brooks. I'm 31 years old and I live alone on a small cattle farm just outside Hartwell, Montana, where the road turns to gravel and the mountains start watching you instead of the other way around. I fix things for a living, mostly fences, engines, busted water lines, whatever a neighbor's too busy or too broke to handle himself. My hands stay rough and my truck stays loud and my fingernails never quite come clean, but the work is honest and it's mine, and out here that counts for more than people in the city would believe. It's not much, this place. A faded red barn, 60 acres, a porch that needs a new step, and a house my father built with his own 2 hands before the cancer took him slow. But it's mine. Every nail of it is mine. And I'll tell you the thing I don't usually tell anybody, because if you're going to hear this story, you might as well hear it true. 3 years ago, I stood at the front of the little church in town in a borrowed suit, and I waited for a woman named Rachel to walk down that aisle and become my wife. She never came. She sent her sister instead, with an envelope, and inside the envelope was a note in Rachel's neat little handwriting that said she was sorry, but she couldn't spend her whole life with a man who would never be more than a fixer of broken things in a town nobody had heard of. She said I was too quiet, too plain, too small. She said, and I remember it word for word because some words carve themselves into you. You're a good man, Caleb, but good isn't the same as enough. Then she was gone, and the whole town watched me take off that borrowed jacket and fold it over my arm and walk out into the rain, and I drove home to a house that had never felt so loud in its silence in all my life. That's the wound. That's the one I carry. I learned to live around it the way you learn to live around an old injury that aches before a storm. I'd wake before the sun, work until my body was too tired to think, eat something standing up at the counter, and go to bed in a house that was too quiet. I told myself I was fine. I told myself that for 3 years. A man can tell himself a thing that long until he half believes it, and the other half just stops arguing. I figured my chapter on love had already been written, and the ending was the kind you don't reread. I had the farm, I had the work, I had the silence. I figured that was the shape of my whole life, and I'd made a kind of uneasy peace with it. And then came the night a woman knocked on my door in the rain and told me her father said I needed a wife. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of cold that gets in under your collar, and the rain was coming down so hard the gutters couldn't keep up. I almost didn't hear the knock over the drumming on the roof. When I opened the door there, she was on my porch, soaked through, a thin coat plastered to her shoulders, holding a little girl asleep against her chest with a blanket over the child's head to keep the worst of the rain off. She had dark hair stuck to her face and the most tired eyes I had ever seen on a person still standing up. She was beautiful in a way she clearly had no idea about. The kind of pretty that's been too busy surviving to ever look in a mirror. "Are you Caleb Brooks?" she asked, and her voice shook, from the cold or the nerves I couldn't tell. I said I was. She swallowed, and she looked down at the child, and then she looked back up at me and she said it so quietly I had to lean in to hear her over the rain. "My father said you needed a wife." She whispered it like she was ashamed of the words, even as they came out of her. "He sent me. He said you were a decent man and that you needed a wife, and that I needed someplace safe to land. So here I am." I stood there a second. Lord knows what my face was doing. And then I heard myself say the only thing that was true. He was right. I didn't even know whose father she meant, not yet, but there was a child asleep in the rain and a woman shaking on my porch, and whatever else was or wasn't true, a man doesn't leave people standing in a storm. I stepped back and held the door and I said, "Come inside before you both catch your death. We'll figure out the rest where it's warm." Her name was Clara Hale. The little girl was Ivy, 6 years old, and not her daughter but her niece, her late sister's child, who Clara had been raising on her own for 2 years now since the accident. And the father who sent her was Walter Hale, a name I knew, though I'd never have guessed it would lead to this. Walter Hale owned half the ranch land on the east side of the valley and a good chunk of the bank in town besides. An old man with old money and an old man's stubbornness. I'd done work for him once, years back, fixed a generator at his place during a winter storm, and refused to overcharge him for the emergency call the way another man might have. He'd looked at me a long time when I handed him that fair bill, and he'd said, "Not many honest men left, son. I'd forgotten about it." Apparently he hadn't. I made coffee while Clara got Ivy settled and dry on the couch under a real quilt. I make coffee when I don't know what else to do with my hands. I set a mug in front of her. And I noticed her fingers were still trembling when she wrapped them around it, and I noticed she held it like the warmth of it was the first kind thing the day had given her. She told me, in pieces, the way people tell you hard things, that her father was sick. The doctors had given him months, maybe less, and he'd gotten it into his head, near the end of his life, that he had to see his only daughter and his granddaughter safe before he went, because there was a man circling them who he did not trust, and he could not die in peace, leaving them to that man. The man's name was Grant Whitmore. I'll come back to Grant. You'll want to remember the name, but for now just know this. Grant Whitmore was Walter's business partner. A smooth man with white teeth and a watch worth more than my truck. The kind of man who shakes your hand and you go count your fingers after. He'd been pressing to marry Clara for the better part of a year, and on paper it made all the sense in the world. 2 old families, 2 fortunes, the natural thing. But Clara had said no, and kept saying no, and Walter, who had spent his whole life reading men, had come to understand that Grant didn't want a wife. Grant wanted control of the land and control of the trust that Walter had set up for little Ivy, and the fastest way to all of it ran straight through Clara. He said you wouldn't say yes for the money, Clara told me, and she laughed, but there was no laughter in it. He said you'd say yes for the right reasons or you wouldn't say yes at all. She set down the coffee. And I want you to know, I think this whole thing is insane. I told him so. A grown woman doesn't show up on a stranger's porch in the rain and ask him to marry her. I'm not asking you to actually, she stopped. She pressed her lips together. I just need a roof while I figure out what I'm going to do. I'll work. I cook. I clean. I'm not afraid of work. I don't take handouts. So before you say anything kind, tell me what the real price is. There's always a price. And right there I understood her, before I understood anything else about her. Because I knew that flinch. I knew what it was to brace for the catch, to have learned the hard way that warm things come with bills attached. I leaned back against my counter and I said, "There's no price, Clara. You and the little one can have the spare rooms as long as you need them. I'll sleep fine knowing you're not out in that." And then, because the practical truth was the only language she'd trust, I said, "But if your father's right about Grant, a roof won't be enough to keep that man off you. A roof he can take you out from under. A husband's a different thing in the eyes of the law. So if it comes to that, only if it comes to that, I'd stand up in front of a judge and make it real on paper. Not charity. I'd be getting a partner on a farm that's too much for one man and a reason to fix that porch step I've been ignoring for a year. You'd be getting safe. Plain trade. 2 people who both need something. That's all it has to be." She studied me for a long moment with those tired eyes, and I watched her decide, slow and careful, that I might be telling the truth. "Separate rooms," she said. "Separate rooms," I agreed. "For as long as you want them. I'm not Grant. You'll never once have to wonder what I really want. Because what I really want is to fix things. And right now you and that girl are 2 things that look like they could use some fixing." From the couch, a small sleepy voice said, "You have kind eyes." It was Ivy, awake after all, peeking over the edge of the quilt at me. "Aunt Clara, he has kind eyes. We can stay." And Clara looked at me, and something in her face came undone just a little, and she said, "Out of the mouths of babes." And for the first time that night she almost smiled. We were married 11 days later at the county courthouse with Walter Hale sitting in a wheelchair as our witness, oxygen line in his nose and a suit that had gotten too big for him, watching his daughter marry a fence fixer he'd met exactly twice. When it was done, he gripped my hand with more strength than a dying man ought to have, and he said, low so only I could hear, "You take care of my girls, son, both of them." That's the whole of it. I told him I would. I meant it the way you mean a thing standing in front of a man who's running out of days. I didn't yet know how much I'd mean it later, for reasons that had nothing to do with a promise. Those first weeks were a strange and quiet kind of beautiful. We were two people learning to share a house who'd agreed not to share much else, and so we were polite and careful, and we found each other in the small things instead of the big ones. Clara cooked, and Lord, that woman could cook. I'd come in from the cold with my hands aching, and there'd be something warm on the stove, and the windows fogged up, and the radio low, and the house would smell like bread and onions and someone living in it, and I'd stand in the doorway a second just to feel it before I let on I was home. She started making tea for Ivy every night, chamomile, the little ritual of it. And one night, without a word, she set a cup down by my chair too. She didn't ask if I wanted it. She just knew, the way she was starting to know things about me. I drank it. I don't even much like tea. I drank every drop. And I fixed things, because that's how I love people even when I can't say the words. I fixed that porch step the first week. Then I fixed the wobbly leg on the kitchen table she'd been bracing with a folded napkin. I fixed the squeak in Ivy's door so it wouldn't wake her. One evening I found a little wooden music box in a box of Clara's things, a pretty old thing with the lid cracked and the works gone silent, and Clara said quietly that it had been her sister's, Ivy's mother's, and it hadn't played in 2 years. So I sat at the kitchen table half the night with my reading glasses and a jeweler's screwdriver, taking that tiny mechanism apart and cleaning the gunk out of the gears, and when I wound it and it finally caught and started to play its small tinkling lullaby, Clara came into the kitchen in her robe and stood very still in the doorway and put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled up. "How did you?" she started, and couldn't finish. I just slid it across the table to her. "Some things aren't broken," I said. "They're just waiting for somebody to be patient with them." I wasn't only talking about the music box. I think she knew it. I think that's the night something started that neither of us was ready to name. Ivy decided I was hers about 3 weeks in. Children make up their minds faster than grown folks, and they're usually righter about it. She started following me out to the barn in her little boots, naming the cows, naming the chickens, naming the old foal we had that fall who took to her like she was made of sugar. She'd hand me tools, the wrong ones every time, and I'd thank her like she'd handed me gold. One afternoon she was sitting on a hay bale watching me weld a hinge, and she said, out of nowhere the way she did, "Are you my dad now?" And I had to set the torch down and take a breath, because that question doesn't have a careful answer. I said, "I'm whatever you need me to be, Ivy. I'm here. That's the part that matters." And she thought about that with her whole serious little face, and then she nodded like I'd passed some test and said, "Okay, I'm going to call you Cal," and went back to naming the chickens. I had to turn around and pretend to look for something on the workbench for a minute. Grown men don't cry in barns. Except sometimes they do. Walter Hale died in October, on a clear cold morning with the aspens gone gold, with Clara holding one of his hands and Ivy holding the other, and me standing in the doorway of his room because some moments aren't mine to stand in the middle of. He went easy, they said. He went knowing his girls were under a roof with a man who'd promised. We buried him on a Saturday and the whole valley came, because whatever else Walter Hale had been, he'd been a giant in that place. And at the reception after, in the church basement with the bad coffee and the casseroles, I watched a man in a beautiful gray suit cross the room toward Clara with his white teeth smile, and I knew before anyone told me. That was Grant Whitmore. He shook my hand. I counted my fingers after. He held Clara's a beat too long and said how very sorry he was and how he'd promised dear Walter he'd look after her, and how this little arrangement of hers, he said the word arrangement like it was something stuck to his shoe, was all very touching, but surely we could all be adults about what came next. Then he looked at me, this fence fixer in his one good shirt, and he smiled wider, and he said the thing that I'll carry the rest of my life because it lit the fuse on everything that came after. He looked me up and down and he said, "Soft, just for the three of us, be honest, friend, what does a girl like Clara want with a handyman? You're the help. You'll always be the help. People like you fix things for people like us." And he patted my shoulder like we were old pals, and he walked off to work the room. The help. I'd been called worse. But I felt Clara go rigid beside me, felt the old flinch in her, the bracing, and I understood that Grant Whitmore had been saying versions of that sentence to her for a year, teaching her she was small, teaching her she should be grateful. And something in me that had been quiet a long time, 3 years quiet, stood up. It got bad fast after Walter died, the way these things do once the man holding the peace is gone. The lawyers came first. Grant filed to have Walter's will examined, claiming undue influence, claiming Walter hadn't been of sound mind at the end, claiming the trust set up for Ivy ought to be managed by a, quote, responsible party with business experience and not by a young widow and her, quote, marriage of obvious convenience. He had money and time and a whole firm of men in good suits, and we had me and a country lawyer named Earl Briggs who I'd gone to school with and who worked out of an office over the hardware store. Grant's strategy was plain as day. He'd paint our marriage as a fraud, make Clara out as unfit and reckless, and make me out as a man marrying up for a payday, and if he could make a judge believe it, he'd get the land and control of Ivy's trust, and Clara would be left with nothing, exactly as he'd planned from the start. The hearing was set for December, and in the weeks before it, the strangest thing happened in that quiet house, which is that pretending to be a family slowly stopped being pretend. I don't know how to tell you the exact moment. There wasn't one. It was 1,000 small ones. It was her laughing for real one night at something dumb I said and then looking surprised at the sound, like she'd forgotten she could. It was the night Ivy had a nightmare and I heard Clara singing to her down the hall, that same little lullaby from the music box, and I lay awake in my separate room understanding with a kind of slow terror that I would burn this whole farm down before I'd let anyone take those two away from me. It was the way she'd started touching my arm when she passed me a plate, just for a second, and the way I'd started living off those seconds. We were married on paper and strangers everywhere else, and somewhere in there the paper had started telling the truth, and neither of us had the nerve to say so out loud. Then came the storm. It was the second week of December, and the forecast had been wrong, the way it gets wrong in the mountains. A clear sky turning to black in a couple of hours, and the temperature falling off a cliff. Ivy had been fighting a cold for a few days, nothing much, and then that night it turned, fast the way it does in little ones. By 10 o'clock she was burning up, her cheeks red and her breath gone shallow and rattling, and the thermometer climbed past 104 and kept climbing. And Clara's careful calm cracked right down the middle. "We have to get her to the hospital," she said, and her voice had the high, thin sound of pure fear in it. And outside the rain had turned to that vicious, freezing mix that coats the roads in glass, and the wind was throwing the barn doors against their hinges, and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes down a mountain road in good weather. I didn't think. I bundled Ivy in every blanket we had, and I carried her out into that black, howling storm, and laid her across Clara's lap in the cab of my truck, and I drove. I drove that road like I'd been driving it my whole life, because I had every wash and curve and place where it likes to ice, and the rain came at the windshield so hard the wipers couldn't keep up, and Clara held that little girl and prayed out loud, and I just kept my hands steady on the wheel and talked low and even the whole way, telling them both it was going to be all right. We were almost there. I've got you both. Just breathe." A branch came down across the road near the bottom, and I stopped the truck and got out in the freezing rain and dragged it clear with my bare hands and got back in soaked to the bone and kept driving. I got them to that emergency room, and I carried Ivy through the doors myself, and I didn't let go of her until a nurse made me. It was a bad fever and a bad infection, and it could have gone the other way, the doctor told us later, if we'd waited even another hour. But we hadn't waited, and around 3 in the morning, after they'd gotten her stable and sleeping and pink again instead of gray, Clara and I stood in that fluorescent hallway, both of us still wet, both of us hollowed out. And she turned to me, and she just came apart. She put her face against my chest, and she shook, and I wrapped my arms around her and held her up, and she said into my shirt, muffled and breaking, "You came out in the rain for us. You didn't even think about it. You carried her. You carried her through the storm." And I said the only thing there was to say. The thing that was the whole truth of me by then. I said, "I'll always come out in the rain for you. Both of you. There is nothing in this world I won't do for you, Clara. I think I've known that for weeks, and I've been too much of a coward to say it." She lifted her face. Her eyes were red and wet, and she was looking at me like she was finally letting herself see what was right in front of her. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. "You don't have to feel that. This was supposed to be an arrangement. You don't have to." "I know," I said. "I know I don't have to. I'm saying it because it's real." And then I kissed her. Or she kissed me. To this day we argue about who moved first, and the truth is we both did, there in that ugly hospital hallway at 3 a.m. with our hair dripping and a sleeping child down the hall who'd brought us together. It wasn't the careful, almost touch we'd been dancing around for 2 months. It was the real one. It was the kind of kiss that has 3 years of silence behind it on my side and 2 years of bracing for the catch on hers, and when we finally broke apart she pressed her forehead to mine and laughed and cried at the same time and said, "Well, so much for separate rooms," and I said, "Yeah, so much for those." And I held her the rest of that night in a plastic hospital chair. And for the first time since I'd buried my father, the world did not feel too quiet. It no longer felt empty. It felt full. But you remember Grant. Grant didn't go away just because we'd found each other. If anything, it made him more dangerous, because now he had something to take. The hearing was 4 days before Christmas. The whole town turned out, because Walter Hale's estate was the biggest story in the valley and because everybody wanted to see whether the slick rich man from the city was going to take everything from the dead man's daughter and the handyman who'd married her. Grant's lawyers came in like an army. They put Clara on the stand and they tried to take her apart. They called the marriage a sham, a calculated grab. They produced the courthouse certificate dated 11 days after I met her and said, "See, 11 days. What kind of real marriage happens in 11 days? They brought up that I'd been left at the altar, made it sound like proof I was a man who'd take any deal that came with money attached. They were good at it. They were paid to be good at it. I watched Clara sit in that chair under all of it and start to shrink, start to believe the smallness they were selling her, and I gripped the edge of my seat so hard I thought it'd crack. Then Grant's lawyer asked her, with a sad little smile for the judge, "Mrs. Brooks, isn't it true that you married this man purely for protection and money, and that there's nothing real about it at all?" And before Clara could answer, a small, clear voice rang out across that whole courtroom from the front bench where she sat next to Earl Briggs's wife. "That's not true," said Ivy. "Cal fixed my mama's music box. And he came out in the rain. You don't come out in the rain for somebody unless you love them. Everybody knows that. The judge should have called for order. He didn't. He just looked at that 6-year-old girl sitting up so straight and so sure, and then he looked at Grant Whitmore, and you could see the whole room turn at once, the way a field of wheat turns when the wind crosses it. Because a child had just said the truest thing anybody had said all day, and everybody in that room knew it. And then it was my turn. They put me on the stand, and Grant's lawyer figured I'd be easy, the handyman, the simple man, the help, and I sat there and I didn't try to be slick because I don't know how to be slick. I just told the truth plain, the way my father raised me to. I said, "I'm not going to sit here and tell you I fell in love with my wife in 11 days. I didn't. I married her in 11 days because a dying man asked me to keep her safe from a man he didn't trust, and because that's the kind of thing a decent man says yes to. That part is true. They got that part right. I let that sit. Then I said, but I'll tell you what they got wrong. They think a marriage gets measured by how it started. It doesn't. It gets measured by whether you stay. I have fixed every broken thing in that house because I didn't have the words for what I felt, so I said it with my hands. I came out in a December storm with ice on the road and a fever climbing because there was a little girl who needed me, and I did not think about it for 1 second, and I would do it again tonight and every night for the rest of my life. That's not a transaction. You can't buy a man who'll drive into a storm for you. Grant Whitmore offered Clara money and a name for a whole year, and she said no every time, because what she was waiting for, what everybody's really waiting for, isn't a man who'll give you things, it's a man who'll stay. I looked right at Grant then. I'm the help. He's right about that. I help. I'll help those two for the rest of my days. That's not the insult he thinks it is. That's the whole job of loving somebody. The room was dead silent. And then Earl Briggs stood up, my school friend, my over-the-hardware-store lawyer, and he said he had one more piece of evidence to enter. It turned out that old Walter Hale, in the last clear weeks of his life, had not been the senile fool Grant's lawyers were painting him as. He'd recorded a video, witnessed by his doctor and notarized, in case it ever came to this, because Walter Hale had read men his whole life, and he'd read Grant Whitmore down to the bone. In it, Walter laid out, calm and lucid, exactly what Grant had done. The pressure on Clara, the threats dressed up as proposals, and the documents which Earl had found in Walter's safe deposit box, showing Grant had been quietly moving money out of the partnership for 2 years, embezzling from the very man he called a friend, planning to seize the land and Ivy's trust the moment Walter was in the ground. It was all there. The crowd that had come to watch the rich man win got to watch his whole face fall apart instead. And the cruelty he'd built boomeranged right back onto him in front of the entire town. The judge threw out his petition before lunch. What's about us is what happened on the courthouse steps after. Clara came out into the cold winter sun with Ivy on her hip, and she found me, and she didn't say anything for a second. Then she said, "You stood up there and told the whole world you love me before you ever properly told me." And I said, "Reckon I did. Did it backwards. I do most things backwards." And she laughed and her eyes filled up, and she said, "Then say it forwards. Once, so I have it." So I set down everything I was carrying and I took her face in my rough hands right there on the courthouse steps, and I said, "I love you. Clara, not the arrangement, not the deal. You, I fell for the real you, and I'm not asking you to be one bit less than everything you are. I want this to be real. No more separate rooms. Marry me again, on purpose this time, in a church in the spring." And Ivy, between us, said, "Say yes. Aunt Clara, say yes." And Clara was crying and laughing, and she said yes. And she kissed me in front of God and the courthouse and the whole town of Hartwell, and somewhere up in heaven I like to think a stubborn old man with old money and a true heart finally got to rest easy. We married again in May, in the little church in town, the same one where I'd once stood alone in a borrowed suit. This time the suit was mine. This time the bride came down the aisle in her late sister's dress that Clara had taken in, with Ivy in front scattering wildflowers from a basket and getting more on herself than on the floor. The whole valley came again, not for an estate this time but for us, and old Earl Briggs cried like a baby in the second row, and when the preacher asked if I'd take this woman, I didn't say I do. I forgot my line entirely. I just looked at her and said, "I already did." 100 times. Every broken thing I fixed in that house was me saying I do, and the church laughed and Clara cried and the preacher said, "Well, close enough, son," and pronounced us man and wife, on purpose, the second time, the real time. It's 5 years later now, as I tell you this, and I'm sitting on that porch I fixed, the one she first stood on dripping in the rain, and I can hear the whole reason for my life going on behind me through the screen door. Ivy's 11 now, all elbows and opinions, out in the barn doing her chores and arguing with the foal that's a grown horse now. And there are 2 more inside that didn't used to be there, a boy we named Walter, after his grandfather he never met, who's 3 and into everything, and a baby girl Rose, who Clara's rocking right now and humming that same old lullaby to, the one from the music box that still sits on the mantel and still plays because I keep it oiled. The house that was too quiet for so long, the house I told myself I was fine alone in, you can't hear yourself think in it most days now. It is loud as a Sunday market. It is full to the rafters. And I wouldn't trade 1 second of that noise for all the silence and all the peace in the world. People around here still call me the handyman. I still fix fences and engines and the things my neighbors can't. Grant was right about that one thing, and he was wrong about everything else, because being the man who fixes what's broken and stays to keep it fixed turned out to be the best thing a man could possibly be. I think about my own wound sometimes, the one from the start, the woman who said good wasn't the same as enough, and I think she was wrong, but not the way I used to want her to be wrong. Good was always enough. It just wasn't enough for her, and thank God for that, because if she'd stayed, I'd never have opened that door on a rainy Tuesday in September. I didn't do anything heroic when you get right down to it. I only opened a door and let two soaked, frightened, beautiful people in out of the cold. She's the one who walked through it. She's the one who decided to stay. All I did was be standing there, plain and quiet and ordinary, when the right person finally knocked. So if you're out there listening to this in a house that feels too quiet in the middle of a chapter you think is your last one, I want you to remember a little girl who knew that you don't come out in the rain for somebody unless you love them. And a fence fixer who almost let the best thing in his life stand soaking on his porch because he was too busy telling himself he was fine. Don't tell yourself you're fine. Keep the door where you can reach it, because you never know what night the rain is going to bring somebody up your steps to whisper that her father said you needed a wife. And you never know that the truest thing you'll ever say in your whole life is going to be two plain words said soft, with your heart finally awake, after 3 long years of